talk, Memory and Identity. 5 writers talk about the difficult and dynamic relationship between the two. This is the next in a series of 10 lectures and performances and presentations that we're doing this spring that we've termed the Innovation Series. And essentially the Innovation Series is, it operates on the premise that art is a bridge to widely different disciplines, and it also underscores our belief that it's this kind of cross-disciplinary dialogue that really leads to student success. All of the programs in this spring series are based on an exhibition that we have in the Blaffer upstairs called Janet Biggs' Echo of the Unknown. And I don't see her sitting right among you, but she's upstairs. And so she's in the building, and sometime during the talk she'll be down, so I hope you can reach out to her and talk to her if you wish. All of these programs are also the product of a steering committee made up of more than 20 faculty and staff here at the university, representing more than 20 departments and colleges. We also have community partners that include the Alzheimer's Association of Houston and Southeast Texas, the Alzheimer's Disease and Memory Disorder Center at Baylor College of Medicine, and the National NANCE, National Alzheimer's Center at Houston Methodist Hospital. So the format for tonight, this afternoon, will be, first of all, I'm going to introduce really the leader of the panel, David McLean, and he will in turn introduce the next of a series of panelists. David Stuart McLean is a PEN American award-winning writer. His work has appeared in Plowshares, the New York Times, The Guardian UK, Guernica, and on the radio program This American Life. He has a PhD from the University of Houston, and he's the co-founder of the Poison Pen Reading Series. His memoir, The Answer to the Riddle Is Me, was named one of the best books in 2014 by Kirkus. He's the Emma Stuckey Writer in Residence at Columbia College, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming David McLean.
I just want to consult the panel really fast. How do you feel about standing? Cool. We're going to sit. I'm 5'9", so it wouldn't have been that different. Hi, thank you all so much for coming. And thank you to my fellow panelists. When I was first approached about doing this, I got really excited because I really wanted to just talk with these 4 people about this, because they all think about this stuff a lot, and it seemed much more interesting than just a standard lecture. More interesting for me. So that's how it works, I guess. Sorry. So my book is about, I woke up on a train platform in India in 2002 with no idea who I was or why I was there. I was taken by a police officer to a guest home. He just assumed that I was a drug addict, which isn't sort of crazy to see like white Westerners in out of sorts in train platforms in India to just be like, drugs. And so he took me to a special guest house where they dealt with lost sheep, foreign tourists, and I found out why it was that one, because the woman who ran the place, her son had died of an overdose, and what they did together was give me an intervention that wasn't for me. I wasn't on drugs, I wasn't on illegal drugs. And so I was given an intervention, and I hit a rock bottom that wasn't mine, which, what are you going to do? And so what I would like to do really quickly is just read the first page and a half of my book, and then sort of discuss some of the things, the way I wrote it and why I wrote it the way I wrote it, and what I've figured out as a result. And so the beginning of the book goes, I was standing when I came to, not lying down, and it wasn't a gradual waking process. It was darkness, 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 then snap, me, now awake, It was hot. My thin shirt clung to my back and shoulders, and my underwear was bunched into a sweaty wad. The heat left the ground in wavy lines, and the air was tinged blue with diesel exhaust. A woman in a burqa pushed past me. A small man in a ragged red vest ducked around me. He was hunched under the massive steel trunk on his back. The corner of the trunk nicked my shoulder as he maneuvered by. I was in the center of a crowd, half searching for the train, half searching for the exits. I stood still. I had no idea who I was. This fact didn't panic me at first. I didn't know enough to panic. In front of me was a train, a heaving, shuddering train, its engine half submerged in smoke, painted a deep red. It blasted its horns, then clanked and panted into motion. People waved to me from open windows as the train shook itself free of the station. I tracked the train's slow-motion progress. As I choked on the bursts of blue exhaust and stared at the receding last car, I wondered if I should have been on that train. I checked my front pockets for a ticket. Nothing. Not even a passport. Now I began to worry. I had lost my passport. I was in a train station in a foreign country without my passport. Then I realized I couldn't even think of what name would have been on a passport if I had one, or what foreign country I was currently in. This is when I panicked. A man in a small nearby stall clanked a pan against a propane burner. He banged and scraped a spatula against the pan that clanged against the metal burner. The sound was impossibly loud, louder than the train had been. I wanted to ask the man for help. I didn't want the man to know that I needed help. I wanted him to stop banging the pan. I could feel a heavy absence in my brain like a static cloud. I couldn't remember anything past waking up. There was a thick mass of nothing up there. My muscles were caught in a constant flinch, waiting for someone, anyone, to punch me. I was alone with no idea how far I was from anyone who knew me. I was alone and empty and terrified. I wiped my face with both palms. I blacked out. And what I tried to do when I wrote that was, as opposed to starting the book like I woke up on a train platform and it was because of Lariam, which is a drug that does this all the time. And now I got 200 pages to fill. Instead, like what I wanted to do was give the experiential feeling of what it was like to wake up on that train platform. And as I was writing it, I realized that one of the things that memory helps with is being able to filter and create a hierarchy of data. So that if I knew that I was supposed to be on that train, then that train meant something to me. Not having a ticket would actually mean something. But since I didn't know if I was supposed to be on that train or the next one, or if I was just picking someone up or whatever, everything was sort of flattened in terms of its import to me. The man selling omelets behind me was as important as the birds picking detritus out of the train tracks. The world was flattened and dilated at the same time. Sometimes I think about Matt Murdock, Daredevil, from Marvel Comics. And when he first woke up from being struck in the face with a radioactive isotope, as these things happen, like the world poured into his hypersenses. Like his super hearing couldn't handle all the sounds coming in. His fingers he was being driven crazy by the texture on the sheets. He could smell the perfume of the dying person 4 doors down at the hospital. And there's something that memory does and personal narrative does in sort of eliminating the details that aren't part of our story at that moment. And it's sort of amazing. I always think about going to Walmart to buy Honey Nut Cheerios and how little of Walmart I actually take in that's not related to Honey Nut Cheerios, right? Because if I went in without an errand, like there's too much data. Like I would freak out, and I have. Maybe some of you have been in Walmart. Or casinos do this to me too, where it's just sort of like, there's so much data, I don't know what to do. And so that's what I found out, is that sort of like the personal narrative not only reinforces our sense of self, but also reinforces the data that we're taking in, which lets us know that the job that we're doing is important at that moment, right? So there's in some ways, the sad way of looking at this is that we're always treating our lives like triage, that we're always just sort of sorting things into, do they relate to me, do they not, get rid of them, rather than sort of absorbing the world in a bigger sort of way. And so sometimes I appear on this podcast every once in a while, and the podcast is sort of directed at people who would aspirationally like to have an experience like mine, which is such an interesting, different audience for me. Like most people are like, never, ever let this happen to me. But this audience really wants it to happen to them because in some ways they see that they'll be able to see the world clearer once they see past their own agendas in the world. And that's sort of really fascinating to me. I wish them luck. I hope they're not driving. But it's that sort of thing that I realize, like how much of identity is sort of tied up in the errands I'm doing that day, and how much of that doesn't really depend on the way my father and my relationship was. I can think about that later when I'm watching Die Hard. But during the day, like usually I'm in this sort of reactive mode of just dealing with sorting data. And that's sort of what is fascinating to me is like, that's how much of identity to me is just sorting data on a daily basis. And that's sort of the opening remarks I wanted to start out with in terms of identity being the sorter and identity hierarchy, data hierarchy of the world. And I'm going to turn this over to Pete Turchi, who I'm just going to ignore this. So I met Pete in 1994 when I was young, a little bit younger than I am now. I was an undergraduate at Warren Wilson College where he was running the MFA program. He's the author of 5 books. And the most recent one is Amuse and Amaze. And he is now teaching at UH. He's been all over recently. And so it's so exciting that you're at UH now, after I left. So it's a real great personal pleasure that Pete's here and sitting right here. And so I turn it over to you.
Thanks. If you haven't had a chance to read Dave's book, The Answer to the Riddle Is Me, I can't recommend it highly enough for a lot of reasons, but the one I'll mention is that, among other things, he went on a journey not by choice that not many people can come back from, having lost his memory and then reached a point where he could recall a lot of the things that were unattainable to him for a long time. And one of the questions the book poses, which is I think fascinating to anyone, is really who are we if we lose our memory of ourselves? That is, if you woke up tomorrow and didn't recognize the people you live with, your parents, your uncles, your friends, didn't recognize your house, didn't know any of that, how would you know who you were? Where does that sense of identity, sense of self come from? He has an anecdote in the book. I might just talk about you the whole time. Okay. He has an anecdote in the book where his parents brought him a tape of a radio show he had done in New Mexico to help him recall something of the past when they came over to see him. And he had some recognition of that guy whose voice he was listening to as the smart aleck DJ on the radio, and didn't entirely like him. Felt quite removed from him. And I think I don't want to be in Dave's shoes to experience that, but I think the challenge is an interesting one. Where do we form our identity, and to what extent is it based on our sense of our past as opposed to whatever that past might have been? I know the work of everybody on the panel, or some of the work of everybody on the panel, and I'm hoping that they will all speak about their own work. So I thought I'd talk about something else, and I'm just going to offer an example of a fascinating study in the difference of of memory. Two books that I enjoyed quite a bit. One is by Graham Greene, and the book is called Journey Without Maps. It's a work of nonfiction, not fiction. When he was a young man, he decided that he wanted to take a journey. He more or less says to the heart of darkness, although he doesn't exactly quote the phrase. It's pretty close. He wanted to. He's feeling a strong sense of guilt, confusion about his religion, his spirituality, some kind of overriding sense, perhaps, that there was a kind of a shame that he wanted to understand, and he thought going to a place where he felt represented an earlier time, an earlier state of being, would somehow inform him. And so he decided that he was going to walk through Sierra Leone and Liberia, which at the time was an even more difficult journey than it might be for some of us today. He just kind of announced this at a family function, and a young cousin of his who said many years afterwards that she had been drinking champagne said she would love to go too. Graham Greene had no intention of taking anybody with him, but he was too polite to just say, "You can't come," and she more or less attached himself to him. So Graham's book is called Journey Without Maps. Barbara Greene, his cousin, is mentioned 11 times and not at any length in his book. Graham Greene's book is highly metaphorical and imagistic. It is an interesting perspective on some of the things that were done in small towns, small villages in Sierra Leone and Liberia at the time. It really is about a very individual man's view of a particular culture at a particular time. A fascinating book, but it's not a typical travel book. It's not the kind of book you would read to see what it was like to travel through Liberia at the time, or to plan your own trip for that matter. So about 20-some years later, after she'd become the lady of somewhere, I forget who she married, but she had married into some more money. And Barbara Greene's father was very ill, and she was spending time with him and wanted to tell him an amusing story. And so remembered this big trip she had taken with Graham, who of course was the famous member of the family. And so started to tell him the story, and then wrote it out and published her version. Right, his version is called Journey Without Maps. Her version is called Too Late to Turn Back. And in her version, you find out things like Graham Greene was carried part of the way. That doesn't come up in his book. Now, it's his. In his defense, he was very ill. He also doesn't talk about the fact that he nearly died from fever during the trip. He said he forgets a few of the days of the trip, but he doesn't go on about how sick he was. He also doesn't mention that some days he would walk miles ahead of his cousin, and so she was the path through the jungle was about a foot wide. And he would be miles ahead, and she was just lost out there with people she couldn't speak to, the carriers who'd agreed to take their stuff. And the natives they were traveling with were going to places they had never been either. And so they were often terrified because they thought they were going into a different kind of heart of darkness filled with creatures, not animals, but devils and cannibal tribes that they feared were going to attack them. But Barbara Greene's book is about the fact that Graham Greene's socks sagged and it drove her crazy. And it's about the fact that only toward the end of the trip did he mention that she looked ridiculous in the shorts she was wearing. It's a very different kind of book. And they were on, in some ways, the same trip, right? They were traveling together for the most part, except he lost her for about 6 days. But they were traveling together. They went to the same places. They stayed in the same villages. They were on the same trip, but they're two completely different books. And some people, when they read the two books, choose one over the other. They say, oh, this is the more artistic version of the trip, or this is the more insightful version of the trip, pointing to Graham Greene's, or this is the more practical or the more comic version of the trip, looking at Barbara Greene's. But of course, one of the things the books inspire you to think about is all the other stories that weren't told, the stories by the men who were carrying their things along this trip, the men and women and kids in the villages that they came upon, many of whom had never seen a European before. Some of the people they met who had in fact seen other European whites and had strategies or thoughts about how to deal with them. Those stories, of course, are not told to us. And as Dave was just saying, the books remind us, or the comparison of the two books remind us in part of how we create meaning through memory. In part, I think, through our own concern. You know, Dave's fascination with Honey Nut Cheerios, I think, really guides him through life in
Yeah.
many ways. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's,
yeah.
it's always a distraction in class. But also, we're all constantly trying to make sense of what's happened to us, make sense of our past, make sense of what's happening now, and maybe even justify what we're about to do by understanding what's happened in the past. And we all tell ourselves different versions of those stories, and occasionally, of course, we're confronted by somebody else's version of our past, which contradicts our own sense of it and causes some trouble. Graham Greene was not happy with Barbara Greene's publication of this book. They eventually made up, but he wasn't pleased. So I thought I'd leave you with one quotation, which is an epigraph to Journey Without Maps. It's one I haul out occasionally, so some of my students just heard it. But it's by Oliver Wendell Holmes, of all people, a man who was asked several times to write his autobiography and refused. But he did write this little scrap, more or less explaining why. He said, "The life of an individual is in many respects like a child's dissected map." He means a jigsaw puzzle made from a map. "If I could live 100 years, keeping my intelligence to the last, I feel as if I could put the pieces together until they made a properly connected whole. As it is, I, like all others, find a certain number of connected fragments and a larger number of disjointed pieces, which I might in time place in their natural connection. Many of these pieces seem fragmentary, but would in time show themselves as essential parts of the whole. What strikes me very forcibly is the arbitrary and, as it were, accidental way in which the lines of junction appear to run irregularly among the fragments. With every decade, I find some new pieces coming into place. Blanks which have been left in former years find their complement among the undisturbed fragments. If I could look back on the whole, as we look at the child's map when it is put together, I feel that I should have my whole life intelligently laid out before me." Implicit in that statement, I think, because of all those conditional phrases, is that we can't do it. I mean, we can't assemble one whole that includes everything, that kind of answers to everything we've done. But I do think it also carries the notion that we're constantly trying to do that, constantly trying to assemble the life. And of course, one of the tragedies, one of the great losses we recognize in people faced with senility is the inability to assemble that story, the inability to put it together in a way that is unique to them. Jamila Lang is a PhD candidate here at the University of Houston and is the former senior nonfiction editor for Gulf Coast Magazine.
Thank you. So when I was thinking about the topic of identity, memory, and narrative, I was thinking along a lot of the same lines as Peter Turchi and Dave, although perhaps a little less eloquently, and beginning with my original understanding of storytelling and narrative, which is that my parents, who are from two very different places. My mother's from Saudi Arabia. She's from a really wealthy, aristocratic Saudi family, and my dad is from a poor, working-class white family in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Every night at our house, it was a war of storytelling at the dinner table, which is basically to say that my parents would come to the dinner table and have a storytelling contest, which would involve stories about their days or stories about their upbringing. It would be a back and forth, which is a pretty good summation of what their marriage was like in general. And I noticed really early on that the stories they were telling, even when they were telling the same story, were wildly divergent. My parents would go to the grocery store together, and my dad would come back. My dad's a mathematician, and he would say, we were there for 2 hours and 15 minutes, and we purchased 1.25 pounds of grapes, and it was $7.13. And I saw, Jack Porter, the head of the math department, while we were there, and checked out, and we were home after, however many minutes. And my mother would tell the same story, and she would say, "Oh my God, I was at the grocery store for 5 hours, and I bought so many grapes that they were overflowing out of the cart. So many that when I was driving home, I couldn't see the back seat of my car. And it took forever, and I wasted my entire day. When we started, the sun was out. By the time we got home, it was finally dark. We saw 1,000 people. So naturally, I just thought my mom was a liar for a really long time until I decided to become a writer. And I realized that what my parents were doing was telling two equally viable but very different truths. My dad is telling a truth that's concerned with factualness, that's concerned with precision. And my mother was more concerned with the emotional truth, with what it felt like for her to be in the grocery store, which is something that was absent from a lot of my father's stories. And so when I decided to write my own stories, I knew that I would have to reckon with these competing versions of truthfulness and decide where I fell along those lines. Especially because I really loved both of those ways of telling, and I felt equally beholden to them. So, and the stories that they were telling said a lot about who they are and about the way they saw the world. The ways that they were constructing these narratives were just really tied to the people that my parents were. And I thought I would just go out and figure out what kind of story I wrote and just join the storytelling contests at my parents' house. But the matter became complicated when I wrote an MFA thesis that was autobiographical fiction, and my mom got a copy of it. And she was pissed. She was so pissed. She just thought that I had gotten the story all wrong, even though it was fiction. She was really mad about every mother character that I had written. And so she decided to rewrite it. She decided to rewrite my MFA thesis, and she decided to send it to me. So every day she would send me the new pages that she had written. The first line of my mom's memoir was, "My name is Rakia, then this story is the truth." So it was really good, by the way. It was just fantastic. She's really just as good a writer as she is a storyteller. Of course I wrote a fictional story about a mother and daughter who get into this kind of book writing contest. And it was sad in some ways because I had to ask my mother to stop writing her book because we were competing, and she was calling me every day and telling me how many pages she had written, which was inevitably more pages than I had ever written. She was really prolific. So what the line of thinking that this began for me was the fact that anytime that you choose to tell a story, anytime especially that a writer chooses to write a story, you're excluding alternate truths. You're really going to war with the other stories of the world. And for me to be able to tell my story or to write my story, I had to kill off my mother's story. And, her book, which, like I said, was really fantastic, will never exist. It will never be told, probably. So this was a concern that I had when I started writing nonfiction, especially. I wanted my writing to embody, to a greatest extent possible, the war between truths that exist. And my memoir, which I'll just briefly describe, is about in the years after September 11th, my father became an internationally famous Muslim convert and religious speaker, and he went on a couple of world tours. He became highly controversial because he was promoting a really liberal version of a religion in a really conservative community. But this also created a mini war in our home because my mother grew up with the Bin Ladens. And my father ended up becoming an FBI informant, informing on the Muslim communities that he was witnessing. And so as I decided to write about this war that was happening in the country and in my family, I knew that any approach that I would take, knowing what I knew about the battle between stories that occurs, would have to acknowledge the competing stories in my family. I didn't want to kill off fully the stories that my father and mother had to tell, and I wanted to pay respect to those stories as I was telling my own story. And so I'll read to you from the beginning of my memoir in progress, and I'll tell you that this came out of a conversation that I had with my dad when I was talking to him about the book, and my dad said to me, "You've got it all wrong." He's like, if you want to tell the story of my life, the interesting part is when I grew up in the projects and, had to fight my way out and, fight my way out of my family and make it out and go to college. And I said, no, Dad, that's not the interesting story. That's not the story worth telling. And my father said, absolutely it is. You have no idea what you're talking about. And of course, he's right to some extent. And so then I wrote this, which is now serving as the beginning of my very in progress memoir. My father will say that the story is unremarkable. He will say that the war, his years as a religious leader, his international fame, his time as an FBI informant, happened once the real story has long passed. He won't find it particularly interesting to note that his wife, my mother, is from an aristocratic Saudi family or that she grew up with the Bin Ladens. He will say that the truly riveting part, the real meat in the very bones, happens many years before in Father Panic Village. In that story, my father's a boy, and he lives in Bridgeport, Connecticut, a town known for its Wonder Bread factory and its violence. His own father, my grandfather, is a refrigerator repairman built like a box who beats his children and wife so ruthlessly that once, when he misses, he puts a dent in his own freezer. My father wants for me to tell the part of the story in which he is still young, his legs long and lean enough to outrun anyone, which he does in Father Panic Village. It's the civil rights era, and race riots bloom like bruises along the East Coast, but especially in Father Panic Village, a housing project where at night, once the city sky has bled out its very last drop of light, even the cops will not set foot. My father is running from the white kids, the black kids, and his father, and the smells of yeast and dough rise in the air as his muscles release upon the pavement like a fist unraveling. He's running from the day, the night, and the city, while the neighborhood kids climb fences to escape the pigs and the addicts. They gang rape a girl in the schoolyard, and they beat each other almost dead, and sometimes dead with boards that are lined with nails. The story ends when my father makes it out of Bridgeport, away from Father Panic Village, and he never returns. Until I tell him my father doesn't know that the city of Bridgeport demolished Father Panic in the 1980s, unable to curb the murder and violence that never stopped. Instead, my father's story ends as he runs, ceaselessly, endlessly, his legs on fire, the streets ablaze from the friction of his feet, while the war in Father Panic Village rages on. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lacey Johnson. And before I read her bio, I'll just say that you should immediately, after leaving this reading, purchase as many copies of her book as I can. I bought 3 and gave them all out after reading it. That's how urgently I think it needs to be read. Lacey Johnson is an artist, activist, curator, and professor, and is the author of Trespasses, a memoir, and The Other Side, which is finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Autobiography, an Edgar Award in Best Fact Crime, and was a Barnes & Noble Discover pick for 2014. She lives in Houston with her husband and children.
Thank you. Thank you, Blackford. Thank you, Dave, and Pete, and Jamila, and Nancy, and everyone. I also kind of just want to talk to everybody. You guys are all people who I am really interested in hearing your thoughts on this. But before we begin the discussion, I do want to say, so I kind of had the opposite problem as David, where, I didn't wake up one day having lost my memory. I woke up one day with this memory that I didn't want. And if you have not heard about The Other Side, 15 years ago now, I was kidnapped and raped by a man that I used to live with and who I used to love. And that event and the trauma of that event was just a memory I couldn't get away from. And despite lots of self-medication and therapy and more self-medication and self-destruction, it was nothing. It was just something that I couldn't obliterate. And it really came to inform how I interacted on a daily basis, not only with strangers who I would encounter on the street, people I would have in classes, my students, my loved ones, my children. And so it really came to sort of be a shadow over my identity. in many ways. So I decided to write this book in some ways to change my relationship to this event and change my memory of it in many ways, and also maybe in some ways change my identity, which seems like a strange task, but I wrote the book to change my brain. And in the process of doing that, I did a lot of research on memory and how memories are made and what memory consists of, and what, even though there was a lot of stuff that I kind of was like, that doesn't matter, that I'm not paying attention to that stuff, I'm going to pay attention to the stuff that I like, that is meaningful to me, which is kind of how memories are made too. One of the things that I really latched onto was this thing that I found that that most of us don't have any significant memories before the age of 4 or 5, which coincides with the time in our lives when we learn to tell stories. And that it's a skill that we learn to tell stories, because if you have any child, or if you've ever met a child who's below that age, and you ask them to tell you what happened, and it's like everything. It's every bit of everything, and it doesn't matter how interesting or how small, and it includes, the big plot-based events as well as these tiny little details, and it wanders off, and suddenly we're in the park, and there's a balloon, and there's an elephant, and I saw it the other day, and let's talk about 2 years ago. Do you remember that one thing that happened? I was totally jumbled. I have no idea how to tell stories. And so the more I read and the more I realized this thing that we call autobiographical memory. There are different kinds of memory, but autobiographical memory about who we are and what our life has happened is made up of stories. And it's made up of stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. It's first-person narration about who we are and what has happened to us. And I think another one of the interesting things that I found is that this process of learning to tell stories and learning to make memories about who we are, a lot of it is, what's involved is this thing called consolidation, where memory gets shifted around in the different parts of your brain. And one of the most important parts of that process is the forgetting of the information that's not relevant. Like David was talking about going to Walmart. When I go to Walmart, I'm not like looking for Cheerios. I'm like, oh my God, there's a person with no pants on. Like, how can we not pay attention to that? Forget the Cheerios. I need to do something. I need to stop and stand here and observe this person. But anyway, with no pants on at Walmart. I worked at Walmart for a really long time, by the way, so I know about Walmart. Walmart is special. So that consolidation, the forgetting of irrelevant information, and I think that idea of forgetting is an important part of how memories are made. And I think then it's also poignant and interesting to note that even the word memory comes from, I've got it it's in my book here. The word memory comes from the French. I cannot speak foreign languages, I'm sorry. Someone say memory in French. Memory. That's my French. Which is something written to be kept in mind, from the Latin memoria, a reminiscence, from the Old Norse mimir, the name of the giant who guards the well of wisdom, and from the Old English mernan, to mourn. Which I think is so interesting, that always in creating memories and what they tell us about who we are, we're forgetting and we're losing another part of who we could have been. I think also, let's see, what else do I want to say? But then, one of the interesting things that I discovered about writing this particular book and this particular memory, this really big traumatic one, is that it didn't, what do you do with a memory that you can't tell a story about? Either because you've forgotten it, or because there just isn't language to describe what happened. That it's not that I can't remember, it's just I can't say it, and there's no way to describe it that fits into a linear narrative, that makes it make sense, like a narrative would. So what do you do with that kind of memory? And one of the things I've found, and that I try to do in writing this book, is that acknowledge that there are sometimes ways of remembering that conflict with one another. I remember some things in multiple ways. For example, one of the things that I write about in the book is I had this cat. who was very ill. He had feline leukemia. And I remember that the cat eventually was put to sleep. And I wrapped the cat in a blanket, a blue blanket that I had knitted, and I buried it in the backyard with my hands. Years later, after that happened, and after I had left this person, after I had been kidnapped and raped and gone on with my life, and I was in grad school, I was sitting in my friend's living room, and her cat walked itself under my hand, and I remembered the other version of what happened, which was that this abusive man that I had lived with had killed my cat in the kitchen while I laid and took a nap in the other room. And I overheard the cat's skull being smashed on the counter repeatedly, and then being taken out to the dumpster. And then this person who was abusive came back into the house to get a knife because the cat was still breathing, and went out and slashed its throat. That's something that I couldn't even, I dissociated from it, and I created this other story. This other story that I told myself, and I told everybody that said, hey, what happened to your cat? Well, I put the cat to sleep. And that is the story that I remembered. And it wasn't even, you know, sometimes I can remember, I remember telling that story. And I remembered it so well that I convinced myself that the other thing had not happened. But once you start really looking closely at the stories that you told yourself about your life, you can remember that there are like things that don't fit neatly into this story, and that you can remember it two ways. When I escaped the apartment that I had been held in, was I walking? I can remember walking. Or was I running with my arms flailing? Because I can remember running with my arms flailing. Or was I walking very calmly? Did I have a board in my hand? Did I have my keys in my hand? I can remember all of those conflicting things, because there's just some memories that narrative cannot contain. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to hand it over to Nancy, who is a poet and distance runner. Her first book of poems, 2 Minutes of Light, won the PEN New England Award, and she's currently pursuing her MFA in nonfiction at UH.
Hi. I normally teach at this times, and I have a ton of students here. So I'd like to say to my students, everything I'm going to talk about here about myself, it's all fiction. So let's just, nothing I'm going to say about myself is true. And for everyone else, I'm writing nonfiction right now. So anyway, currently I'm working on a nonfiction project about diagnoses and specifically multiple personality diagnosis. My project has been shaped by my own experiences. Basically living for years in inpatient psychiatric wards when I was in my early and late 20s. During that time was the time when childhood sexual abuse and abuse stories were coming out, people were talking about that. And the trauma specialists at that time were trying to grasp onto a way to help all of us. And one of the things they constructed was this idea that multiple personality was a good way to help trauma victims. Before the book Sybil was written, MPD was a very rare disorder. There have been like 10 in 100 years. Between 1985 and 1995, 40,000 new cases emerged. 40,000 new diagnoses. So I was, I was on a hospital, and it seemed like a manufactured diagnosis. In fact, all of us in the same support group at the university where I was attending all came out with MPD. So my project is not, I believe it's a real diagnosis, but for me it was not. And so the reason why I think I sort of hung on to it, because the prognosis during that time, the doctors had said, and these were the best of the best trauma specialists, had said you have a better prognosis with multiple personality than you do with either PTSD or borderline or other things that they were diagnosing people with. And that was, for me, wow, there's a way to get better. here I have this set of things I can do and start here and end here. And the set of things that I had to do were kind of interesting. It was basically the doctors were making metaphors for my despair and experiences. And that's pretty much what I think a diagnosis is in a lot of ways. But this was actually like drawing my my emotions, making them into actual characters, and I was drawing them and mapping them and connecting them with lines and, you know, just kind of making these names up out of my head because that's what I thought, that's what I needed to do to get better. So, you know, I was, so how this kind of relates to the writing process, first of all, I think, you know, diagnosis is it's the way to structure a self-narrative, right, about yourself or identity, and you really reduce the self to a set of symptoms or, you know, characteristics. Nothing else is really considered. And for me, writing is like creating one big metaphor for one aspect of myself. Something I want to focus on within a certain amount of pages. So that's kind of hard to do. It's very challenging for me, especially because I like writing poetry, to create a narrative that also kind of reflects this fragmentation in identity. So you know, the way I'm structured right now, I have to concentrate on making a convincing self, really, a self that makes you want to read on, and you know, this cogent person. And it is, you know, it is challenging. Prioritize. We all have been talking about hierarchy here. MPD is really, multiple personality is really based on memory, memory retrieval. For me, I never forgot what happened in the past. I didn't just suddenly wake up after hypnosis and had all these memories. For a lot of people, that was happening, and we've heard there was a lot of backlash, the false memory syndrome. People, they were, you know, sending death threats to this hospital I was at. Anyway, it was crazy, really crazy time. Very bizarre. But I think the way that I'm trying to take all these memories and all these pieces of myself and to express fragmentation and sort of self and time, not as points, separate points on a line, but this whole squiggly sort of journey that connects all these dots but continues on. And I think that's a challenge of writing about memory and identity. And, you know, another thing is, and you guys all touched on this, is writing about something abstract, writing about something that you don't have even words for, or that can be expressed in a million different ways, is it's difficult. It's hard to do. But in some ways, writing about memory or writing about your life has some sort of girth to it. Like, here we have this piece, and this is who I am. And it was exactly like my diagnosis with MPD. Here I had, you know, this thing. Unlike depression, which manifested itself in different ways, MPD was this thing that it's like, I have this thing, I have this chart that when all the people, the mean people and the tile people and whatever, very bizarre, started talking to each other, that was the way to to healing, or so, you know, I was told. I think, you know, memory right now is can be like a selfie. You know, the self gets reduced to kind of a template. It's kind of flat and sort of ubiquitous. You know, it's this symbol of here I am now, or I was there. And so piecing that, you know, sometimes writing about memory is just like that. But also, you know, and consciousness is such a furious editor, you know, so that's a challenge. But also I have to ask myself in diving into this project, which is very hard. You know, it's hard to share right now. who knows if it's ever going to become a book, or who knows? But I have to ask myself: is writing a way to process loss for me? Is it a way to process loss of all the experiences I never had in my 20s because I was living, I was a professional patient living in these, psychiatric wards. Is it, a way, or is it rediscovering something entirely new by losing that experience, or those sort of memories that are three-dimensional? I can possess something entirely new, something I've never experienced before, which I think is a gift. It's a gift because it's helping me get away from sort of diagnosis. After about a couple of years of these hospitals, knowing that my diagnosis wasn't right, wasn't true for me, I got on a plane and left for California and said goodbye, and that was it, no more NPD. And I proceeded my life to do many self-destructive things as possible. But, and then, did I know you then?
No, we
but
shared that cross.
So, I was just thinking of something Rebecca Solnit said, and she said, and this is, reading it again and again, I get more confused, but it seemed good when I found it. She says in Far Away Goodbye, to forget the past is to lose the sense of loss that is also memory of an absent richness, and a set of clues to navigate the present by. The art is not one of forgetting, but letting go. And when everything else is gone, you can be rich in loss. Thanks.
Great. That's great. So I would like to just, sometimes when I teach, I think like the worst thing that can happen to a writer is a diagnosis. Because in some ways they start to write as the mouthpiece for the diagnosis. It's the same when you see a writer read Marx for the first time, and then like suddenly Marx is everywhere, right? And it's like, and there's so much that gets excluded because it's not Marx, it's not MPD, it's not bipolar, right? Because that's the organizing principle. And it's actually all the stuff that doesn't fit the diagnosis is actually what makes the story. It's not the diagnosis that makes the story, it's the stuff that actually sort of makes diagnoses troubling, because they're all just sort of guesses, right? Like,
Well, yeah. I mean, they changed multiple personality disorder, several years ago to dissociative identity disorder. Yeah, and that changed the way people were, how people saw themselves and how doctors saw them. Just in a single, the letters were just changed, and yeah, it's not this stable, factual thing.
so my question in that I sort of wonder about a lot is confirmation bias in sort of writing pieces about memory, confirmation bias in writing narrative about ourselves. Like, how do we usurp that sort of confirmation bias, which any good scientist knows to be wary of? But sometimes, like, I'm not sure I have the language, and I'm not sure sometimes my students have the language. Is sort of like, how do you get around the line that you're getting to, right? The way that you've thought about yourself, and how do you sort of dilate the picture so you can write the self that you didn't know that you also were? Does that?
Jim,
Is that
like
just
vodka or something?
right? Yeah. No, I sound more and more like David Carradine as I teach.
I mean, I think for me, obviously memoir is the perfect vehicle, because memoir, despite its reputation as being, a new word for autobiography, memoir is about memory. And so in many ways, the book is not about this terrible thing that happened to me. It is about memory and what the nature of memory and how memory works. And, you know, I can get around, you know, I think what's troubling about what you described, you know, the sort of renaming of MPD as DID, is that it's official and there's an authority who is doing such a thing, and then this authority, you know, just all of a sudden changes everyone's identity. And, you know, for me, I had that relationship with like the official documents for my case, which were police reports and newspaper clippings and all these things that are supposed to be factual, that I'm supposed to be able to measure my memory against, or photographs for that matter, or journals, or, you know, we all have these kinds of archives of our own experience. But if you actually start to look at them, even things like police reports have errors. And there were some that I say, no, I didn't find, you know, the keys still in my car. I specifically remember finding the keys on this table because I did this and I did this and I did this. And I know that's what happened. I know that thing is wrong that you wrote there. And you misheard me when I reported it. Or the ways that the journalists, no offense, you know, sort of massage the story to the one, just slightly, just the slightest bit of, you know, coloring the details in a particular kind of way, which to me made me really upset because they, you know, like that thing with your dad or your parents, and I've had that same experience with my parents. Like, don't write about your parents, for Christ's sake, just period, unless you want to get in a fight with them. But if you get it even slightly wrong, it makes the person whose memory it is really angry because that's who they are, right? And so I just took that as another voice, not as the voice, but a voice, and said, oh, isn't it interesting that I remember it so differently from that? And is there a way to find the memory beneath that memory, beneath the story that I've told about myself all these years that has changed and shifted depending on what needs I had at the time? Because that's the snarky thing about memory, is it does shift and change depending on what we need it for.
And that's the cat story, right? Like,
Right.
because in that cat story is like this glaring horror, right? And it's just sort of like, how much else in my life have I constructed these narratives to protect me from glaring horror?
Right.
And at what point is the curtain going to be pulled back so I can see that horror?
Right.
And that seems like, is that the sort of life I'm living then? Is the life behind this curtain?
Well, I mean, we all are. I mean, yes, the answer is yes.
Good.
We are all living a life behind a curtain. You know, there's even even something more innocuous, that in the police reports it says that there was this female officer who came to meet me at the door of the station when I came to go, oh my gosh, this terrible thing has just happened. It's a female officer who met me and took me back and took my report and drove me around and took me to the hospital and did all these things. I do not remember her at all. Like, I remember her, but she was not the person who met me at the station. There was a male detective who met me at the station who reminded me of my uncle, right? And I remember that he reminded me of my uncle. I can see him sitting there and writing things in his notepad and going out to make some calls, and I can see this man very clearly. But when I try to remember the woman instead, it like all starts to unravel, and then I have no faith in anything at all. Like, the whole curtain comes back, and then there is no officer, there is no door, there is no police station, there is no nothing, because the whole thing starts to unravel. Right? So I think I'm okay with that. I'm okay with knowing that that's a wrong
Right.
memory, and acknowledging I know that's a wrong memory, but it's the one that I have.
I think all memoir is dealing with at least two competing impulses, which is that you want to sit down and write a story, but also that memoir will inevitably force any writer to confront the limitations of that story and of memory and the way that it butts up against other versions. And this conversation reminds me of, I'm reading Throne right now, which is by Carrie Howley. And it's really interesting, and it's gotten a lot of press about the fact that you're reading this memoir about a girl, a woman, who's following around some cage fighters. She's like becomes obsessed with these cage fighters and abandons her graduate school crowd to kind of follow them around and become their ultimate fan. It's a memoir, and then on page 60 it says, by the way, anyway, the narrator that you've been reading is totally made up. Like Kit, that's the woman's name, is a work of fiction. And she has a line that I think is really, really good, which is that she says something to the extent of, every narrator is a work of fiction, and the good ones just have the decency to admit it. Which reminds me of what you were saying. I think that's the responsibility of the writer. Once you start finding those gaps or those arguments that happen as you're trying to capture memory, to present that, to give a nod to that, or to establish that conflict within the story that you're trying to tell.
One of my favorite illustrations of this is Mark Twain's book, Life on the Mississippi. Jonathan Rabin, the contemporary writer, has a wonderful essay about life on the Mississippi. But Mark Twain wrote Life on the Mississippi when he was, well, I'd say taking a break from, but really he was just exasperated with his attempt to write Huckleberry Finn. And he was having a hard time with Huckleberry Finn because he had set out to write a sequel to Tom Sawyer, his most popular book. And he got well into Huckleberry Finn and realized that it wasn't really a sequel to Tom Sawyer. It wasn't going to make people very happy, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. And so he took a break because he'd been writing these short autobiographical pieces about learning to be a riverboat pilot, which had been a big hit as magazine pieces. And he was asked to write a few more and produce a book. And Mark Twain was always happy to make a few bucks. And so he thought this would be relatively easy to finish off and went about doing it. But when he tried to fill in the gaps in that story, he realized that he no longer wanted to tell just kind of whimsical, humorous, entertaining stories about the Hannibal of his youth, because he also wanted to somehow access the death of his brother in a steamboat explosion, the Civil War and the destruction of towns in the war, and the fact that steamboats were no longer around. They were all gone. And he felt a great loss that whole part of his youth was gone. And so really he was quite sad about this thing that he was writing comic essays about. And in Life on the Mississippi, you really see the breakdown of our writer. There are comic anecdotes, funny little bits. There are bitter pieces, things that look more like his later writing. And then there are just big chunks of information and material that he took from all kinds of other sources, things that interested him, things that might have been padding at some point. Jonathan Rabin argues that you can basically see everything on Mark Twain's desk by looking at Life on the Mississippi, because he was hauling things into it. But really you see him trying to make some transition from the very popular entertainer, the kind of David Sedaris of his time, the popular entertainer, trying to say something more serious and at that time more important to him, without completely divorcing himself from the readers he had, and also from who he thought of himself as, because he'd been quite depressed as a young man. And then in Huckleberry Finn, you see, of course, somebody trying to grapple with all kinds of other issues in a different way. And then later in his career, you see him quite bitter and angry about all sorts of things. But that's really the story of that book, of him trying to decide not only who he was, but how he wants to present himself, and realizing that the different ways he sees different parts of his life are in such conflict that he doesn't have a voice to say it in. And so that book is kind of a mess, but it's a very instructive mess. And he, toward the end of his life, said he thought it was his best book. I'm not sure it is his best book, but it's one of his most interesting books.
Even when you acknowledge their distinctness, or even acknowledge different possibilities of how the scene could be, you had to nail them down. You had to make them distinct. You had to give them clear vision. You had to clarify the lens. Focus the lens. And you're talking about how memory forms identity, but I want to ask you, for all of you, in the process of doing that, if you found that changed your memories in any way. And because we're talking about one form or the other, but I want to look back at the effect on memory. Did it change your memories? And did that, in a way, change who you are? Did the process of writing your memoir, the process of being a writer and putting it down and clarifying was it by definition clear? change who you are and change what you remember. That's my question. It's for all of you.
Yeah, I think, should I go first? Is that all right? For me, writing the book was, and Lacey actually, this is interesting that Lacey's here because Lacey knew me when I first came to the program. And one of the things I actively tried never to do was ever engage with telling my story. Like I never tried to do that.
You mean before you read it?
Before I started writing it. I could every once in a while tell it as a funny story. And I think sometimes trauma stories, like the first step with dealing with trauma stories is anecdote, because anecdote is such a tight little controllable story form. And I would tell the funny version when I would tell it, I would tell the funny version like I was William Powell and I had like traipsed to India and lost my memory, gosh darn it. And I would tell this like funny story about it. And there's lots of funny bits about losing your memory in India. And then coming home, and the first thing I saw on TV, I was whacked out on antipsychotics and Valium. And I turned on the TV, and the thing that was on TV was Al Roker's gastric bypass surgery. Which sometimes people say to me, they're like, wow, that happened to you in India. That must have been really strange. I'm like, look, seeing Al Roker split open like a broiler chicken, way stranger than anything I've ever seen. Because, like, as soon as I started saying that, like, in your head, you were like, oh, Al Roker. He has such a good relationship with his fans. He's so open. And you know, Al Roker is always sort of like dealing with his weight. And so, like, all the Al Roker narrative comes up to sort of like diminish the severe absurdness of Al Roker's intestines in HD television. And so, like, for me, writing this was getting past just telling the funny story about Al Roker's intestines. And instead sort of getting to this point of recognizing that something bad had happened to me, but also recognizing that there would be parts that were never going to be integrated. I have a lot of students who often have the big horrible thing that happened in their lives, and they'll say, well, I'm not ready to write it yet. And that myth of being ready to write it is always really fascinating to me. It's like at some point we'll reach a place where we'll be like, and now I'm ready. It's like, no, you can write it now, and you can write it again, and you can write it again. And that's what I finally had to do, is I had to write it so many times to get past all of the it's an art gallery. All the bullshit that I had sort of protected myself with, and I had to write past all of that stuff to get past all the self-protective stuff. But then there's the theory in memory that every time you remember a memory, you're chemically altering that memory. And so in some ways, you're remembering the last time you remembered the memory more than you're remembering the memory. And so there are some people that is just horrible, right? That what they want is the videotaped sacrosanct thing, right? And that's supposedly the memory you remember least is the memory that has the most allegiance to the thing that's being remembered. But if you think about a baseball glove or a pew in a church that's been around for 300 years, like that memory that you've remembered so many times is so much more integrated into your life and so much more owned by the personality, and sort of it's sort of like barbed wire that's been swallowed by a tree. Like it's more part of the self than the memory you don't remember. Is that? Maybe that's how I feel about it.
I feel the same way about writing. I think I've been trying to write the story forever, and it started off as anecdotes, just like, and some of them were just these wacky, I'm walking to the Golden Gate Bridge and stop at this bar and, you know, intent on killing myself, and then I get arrested by this cop, and, you know, all of that happened, but, you know, I was making it seem really cool almost, you know, and like exciting. And, you know, I had these sort of clips, some of them were really funny about being in psych hospitals, but being in group therapy, you know, there's a lot of funny things that happen, you know, fights about, I don't know, tissue paper or something. But as I've continued to write and I've rewritten these stories so many times, I have found that that was true then, the way I felt about these people or the way I, you know, felt about myself, but it's not true now. So what I'm writing is, you know, these past feelings, how they've changed through writing. So I am a changed person because I no longer look at those experiences as, oh, they're so funny. I want to express them in this way that's, you know, oh, I was, you know, just this freaked out kind of person. I want to be sincere and compassionate, so I've changed the way I look at myself and those experiences. If that makes sense.
Do you think in some ways when you're writing a memoir, you're sort of saving yourself the problem of paying a psychoanalyst and you're just answering the question yourself? You, as they say, tell me more, and you're saying to yourself, tell me more?
I
You know,
spent
the classic.
Yeah.
I spent a lot.
Yeah.
No,
I always tell my students, I'm like,
no. I'm
this
not saying
isn't going
in
to
a
make
negative
you
way.
healthy. This isn't.
Well, but it sounds like you evolved in some sense. I mean, you're not saying it made you sick, are you?
Well,
You know?
it definitely didn't make
If you're not saying
life
I'm confused.
easy while I was writing it. While I was writing it, I had to relive
Yes.
that stuff. And I think that's the really awful thing. I think denial is so great in comparison. We all are like, oh, denial is so terrible. Americans,
No,
we
that's-
hate denial. But because it means that we're not working hard. But like,
that's why I was drawing the analogy to
To-
an analytic session.
to sort of to dive back into trauma is to just invite trauma back into your life and
Yes.
live with that trauma again, and that is and not to do it under somebody's care. Instead to do it in a room by yourself, listening to Glenn Gould every day. Like that was not necessarily the healthiest thing in the world, but it did.
In the end, you do it yourself if you progress. No matter who you're
Yeah, I'm
trying to
interested.
help you.
I'm interested in the end. I can't wait until the end.
Well, you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I do. I'm being
No, I
purposefully
understand.
oblique, but
Well, it's what you're doing is you're self-diagnosing. You're,
Yeah.
you know, you're giving names to things.
Yes.
You know, I had, for example, until I started writing this memoir, I don't think I ever said out loud the words my father was an FBI informant. It's just like, oh, my dad is a guy who meets with this dude in a hotel sometimes. And
much different
or
story.
someone's happening in the Middle East.
Interesting.
Or
way
at
to
the
say it.
time when all this was happening, I was in a highly, very physically abusive relationship, which are also words that I hadn't used until I started writing. I was in a physically abusive relationship. I would just say I was in a terrible relationship with a man who hit me sometimes. And that act of naming, of having to pin things down, in some ways is liberating, but in a lot of ways is limiting. Yeah, and it's a difficult process, I think.
I think also, there's a common conception that like writing memoir is therapeutic or something, and I agree with everything that's been said, that in many ways it's re-traumatizing and it's painful. And I think, my goal in writing The Other Side was not, even though I said I wrote it to like change my brain, like I was trying to write a book,
Right.
I was writing a book and I wrote
Right.
the book, and in writing the book, like the goals of writing a book are different from the goals of a therapeutic session, where the goals of therapy are healing. And, you know, in writing the book, I had to like cause harm, in many ways. But, though I feel like I succeeded in changing my brain in many ways, it was because, it was kind of in spite of the writing, and you know, also in a lot of ways the sort of healing that happened came after the book was done and was about to come out. You know, because I had never, the first time I had ever admitted in public to people, you know, there were a few group of people, a select group, small group of people who knew this had happened to me, and then people who had taken writing workshops, but I'd never actually acknowledged in any of the writing that I did early on that anything bad had happened. It was all kind of writing around this giant black hole of silence of things that I couldn't say. And so the first time I ever read from the book was here at the University of Houston. I read it with Pete and Matt Johnson, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna tell everybody, all these like mentors that I used to have and people I have to work with, that I got kidnapped one time and raped by this weird dude. You know, and so I was terrified. I was completely petrified and also really ashamed, and just like I had all these like bad, crazy feelings. And it was through the process of like speaking publicly and going, well, that's silly to feel that way. Like, why should I feel that way? Nobody, you know, has any returned my bad feelings. It's only me that feels bad feelings about this thing that I remember, because they don't share that memory. They don't have that relationship to those events that I had to those events, and it was through talking publicly, which I guess is what therapy is, right? That I you know, that I felt much more at ease in relationship to what had happened.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. It was definitely the book tour that sort of allowed it to be skits almost, where I could just have like bits that I could say, and that I had constructed these very clear levies against, like, because I couldn't go out and cry every night.
Yeah.
Like, and that just wasn't gonna happen.
Right.
And so I had to figure out the way to tell the story in a way that wasn't the book, but was about the book, but wasn't the book.
Yeah. Right. I know what you mean by bits. Like in my office, so in the book I don't name the person, he doesn't have a name, and I don't like to say his name, his real name. And so in the office we call him Voldemort, you know, because you can't speak his name. You know, but there's a lot of, you know, and even in the book I acknowledge, like, there are funny versions of the story that I try to tell. They're not very funny, like nobody laughs, but like it cracks, you know, like
Right.
a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I got kidnapped and raped.
Right.
See, nobody laughs. I think it's funny.
Right. But it's trauma shtick. It's like you get into trauma shtick as much as you can get into any other kind of shtick. That, like, it's even if it's funny shtick, if it's brainy shtick, if it's whatever, there's trauma shtick too. And there's like, trauma shtick is kind of the worst because trauma just hangs out in your chest, and once trauma shtick shows up, the thing in your chest fights, and like it's taking notes. It's like, I know what you did. You told that at a dinner party, asshole.
Right.
I'm going to take that out of you. And so yeah, it's interesting. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a question. So the consensus seems to be that memory is a construct, that we're all, you know, there are different perspectives, and I've recently been hanging out with psychologists at NYU that are doing those enzyme studies about reconsolidation, and the current context always changes memory. So if this is all the case, what's your relationship to nonfiction and perhaps responsibility? And is nonfiction, is that a fiction?
That's a little wind-up question. That's a little,
Yeah.
finish it off in a minute.
We can just answer that in 2 minutes.
Well, I mean, memory is I mean, it is a construct, but it's also a structure, right? It's a giant structure for containing massive amounts of first-person narration, as well as other kinds of memory as well. But, you know, if we're thinking about, we're gonna all talk about autobiographical memory. And so it contains all this memory along with, you know, high-resolution files like sounds and images and smells, and it contains all that, and they're kind of like tagged onto this, you know, giant structure full of first-person narration. But there are many, it's a really complex filing system. There are many levels. There's, you know, this sort of, lifetime periods. So when I was in college, when I was in grad school, when we lived in Spain, like these big swaths of information. And then from there, you kind of can scroll down and it gets into subfolders. And all the folders, you know, implies that they are sealed. But, you know, sort of subcategories of when we used to hang out at Cecil's in grad school, okay? And then you go from there to, there was this one time when our friend's 30th birthday, and we were hanging out at Cecil's or PJ's, it must have been PJ's, and we were having a karaoke party, and we all got t-shirts, and now you're into like specific recollections, right? But what I think is interesting, you know, the difficulty in writing nonfiction is that in actual memory, the way it exists in your brain, there's no such thing as like a memory, right? There's no single thing that you can go, that is a memory, because it's all memory. The whole part of it, the filing system and everything that goes in it, and it's all interconnected, and there isn't one thing that you can say is a memory. So this, you know, putting it in a box and singling these memories out is a false thing, you know, because you're saying these are the things that are not connected to, they're only connected to themselves, they're not connected to anything else, which is a fiction, right? But I think responsible nonfiction writers say, you know, they acknowledge when they're, like, I personally, as I said, like, I don't have any problem saying, like, this is the way that I remember it, even though I acknowledge that it's not what the documents show as being the actual thing that happened. And that is, I think, where it shifts from being like an autobiography, these are all the things that happened to me, how I got to be such a fabulous person, to I am now writing about life and experience and what it means to be a human. And because being a human means you remember one thing, even though the facts tell you something else, and you acknowledge it, and you need to make sense of it anyway. And you need to find a way to make meaning out of that discrepancy and out of the story that you've chosen to believe or chosen to remember, as well as the one that you chose to not. That all of that, I think, is part of what a responsible nonfiction writer does. Does that answer your question?
It does. Does it make you more suspicious of, say, journalists, reading a paper?
Yes.
Of things that are presented as...
I was always suspicious of that.
Yeah.
Should be.
Yeah, always.
Oh, my wife's a journalist, so yes. Terribly. My really quick anecdote about this is this is some of you have heard this. I lived in a house that had 2 floors, 2 bathrooms, 1 TV. I was the smallest of 3 siblings, so when like Manimal went on commercial break, my sisters would body check me out of getting to the bathroom downstairs, so I had to run upstairs. And then my sisters would call through the vent, because this is their one act of kindness in my childhood. They would call through the vent and say, the show's starting again. And so I would start to run downstairs. And I would run, and I'd get to the top of the stairs, and I would slip. And that first moment, it's like you're flying. And when I was a kid, I was like, no, I can fly. This is amazing. It took me until I was 8, but I can fly, and this is the greatest thing ever. And then I got to about here. And then I was like, oh no. And then I would hit the step, and I'd be like, ow! I live in a world of pain. Oh, wait. And then I'd be aloft again and flying and be like, that's what the chandelier looks like from here, right? And so like I would have this experience of like flight and pain and flight and pain and flight and pain. And I'd get to the bottom of the stairs, and my parents, who parented by clamor, sort of would show up because something loud had happened. And then they would say, well, what happened? And I'd be like, I don't know. And they say, well, you fell down the stairs. And I was like, oh, I fell down the stairs. And that sentence bulldozes that entire experience of flight and pain. And I feel like that's how we usually tell stories. I fell down the stairs a lot as a kid. Rather than, often as a child, I thought I could fly. And so in my book, I tried to write from the point of view of the kid who just slipped, but didn't know what was going on. And so that's I think it's different from like a nut graph, right? Where it's different from like the inverted pyramid of journalism, where we're going to get to the bottom of why my parents never carpeted the stairs. Oh God, no! But you know what I mean. Like, so there's something about that experiential information that's foregrounded versus the sort of flattened story.
Would you say it's the responsibility of journalists to the flattened story, like to the official narrative that comes from the parents? Would you agree with that?
It's interesting. Like, I wonder how that flattened version works, because it's a really important thing. Like, at this time at night, Dave McClain fell down the stairs,
Right.
and his parents said, "Walk it off."
Right.
Like that's an interesting, but I think it's such an anecdotal way of talking that it removes any of the experience of it, and that's I think what creative nonfiction, that's its job, is to reinvigorate the language with the experience of it.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. When you're talking about your memory playing tricks on you, that you remember things the way that you remember them, and they weren't necessarily true, but they were your memories. When you went back to correct them, and say the detectives or whoever else had made their reports, did you ever question their ability to remember things correctly?
I mean, of course. Of course. I mean, I don't think anybody has the ability to remember anything correctly. And it's interesting that you say my memories played tricks on me, because I think I actually played tricks on my memory. Like the other way around. Like, I told it a story that I wanted to believe and then convinced myself that it was the true one. But, you know, I am not very invested in that. You know, maybe I'm a bad nonfiction writer in that way, but I'm not very invested in this notion of capital T truth. Like, I think it's much more interesting for me, just as an artist, as a writer, to try to hold multiple conflicting perspectives in my head at the same time and sort of use those as the tension between them as a path to inquiry, just as a sort of mode of investigation. You know, I've got these two things, and I know they can't both be true, but isn't that interesting? Like, what do I do with this? Where do I go from here? And I don't know that I feel like I have to resolve, like I have to settle on, this is the right answer, this is the one that matters, the true one is the one that the detective said. I don't have any desire to do that. I don't find that appealing or interesting at all.
Well, thank you all so much. There's food and stuff, so thank you. Thank you all. Really, really appreciate it.